In 1975, Ethiopia abolished private land ownership, seizing 45 million hectares from its own farmers, the largest nationalization in African history, built on the same logic that starved millions in Soviet Russia and Mao's China. Within a decade, up to 1.2 million were dead. The world blamed drought. The real cause was policy, and the question Ethiopia still can't answer, whether it will ever trust farmers with the land itself. On March 4, 1975, the Derg regime signed Proclamation No. 31, erasing centuries of rural tradition and declaring that every hectare of Ethiopia's farmland now belonged to the state. This was not a redistribution, it was a total erasure of private rural ownership. The new law banned the sale, mortgage, or inheritance of farmland beyond the immediate family. 45 million hectares, from the highland terraces of Amhara to the lowland plains, were swept into government hands overnight. The ancestral plots that had defined family identity for generations became property managed by political decree, not by the people who worked them. At the heart of this new order stood the peasant associations, 20,000 local committees, each tasked with enforcing the rules, allocating plots, and policing their neighbors. These associations replaced the old patchwork of crown, aristocratic, church, and customary landholding with a single state-run system. 5.5 million households were reorganized, their land assignments subject to quotas and the shifting priorities of central planners. No compensation was offered to those who lost their land. Security of tenure became a promise that could be revoked at any time. The logic behind Ethiopia's land revolution echoed the Soviet Union's forced collectivization and China's Great Leap Forward. In both cases, turning agriculture into a tool of ideology led to disaster. Millions died, and the countryside was left scarred for decades. In Ethiopia, the state's grip on the soil became the foundation for every later crisis. When the right to farm became a privilege granted by the government, not a birthright, the bond between farmers and their land was broken. The consequences would soon become impossible to ignore. Drought alone does not explain the disaster that swept across Ethiopia from 1983 to 1985. In Wollo, Tigray, and Begemder, entire communities were emptied by hunger. The death toll is still debated. Some estimates reach 1.2 million, others count 400,000. But every figure tells the same story. A rural society stripped of its defenses when the rains failed. Farmers, who once relied on grain reserves and local trade, faced state procurement quotas that demanded up to half their harvest at prices set far below the market. The grain they grew was diverted to urban centers, the military, and export contracts, leaving households with little to store or sell. As war spread, movement was tightly restricted. Permits were required to travel, and roads were often closed to keep food from reaching rebel-held areas. The result was isolation and helplessness, even as food aid began to arrive. By 1984, international relief accounted for a quarter of all cereals reaching Ethiopia's people. But aid was not enough to fill the gap left by failed policies. The world responded with an outpouring of charity. Bob Geldof's Live Aid concert in July 1985 raised more than $127 million in a single day, while Band Aid's anthem sent millions more. Ethiopia became the face of famine on every television screen. Yet, behind the spectacle, the rescue narrative often obscured the reality that policy, more than nature, had turned a drought into a catastrophe. The state's grip on land and food distribution left farmers exposed, their agency replaced by dependence. The famine was not just a tragedy. It was a warning about what happens when a nation built on farming turns against its own farmers. After the Derg's collapse, many expected Ethiopia's new leaders to restore a measure of farmer autonomy. Instead, the 1995 constitution enshrined a different promise. Land would remain the common property of the nations, nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia, with Article 40, subsection 3, forbidding sale or mortgage. The rhetoric of revolution faded, but the substance of state control endured. The Rural Land Administration and Use Proclamation of 2005 spelled out the rules. Farmers would receive use rights, not ownership, and these rights could not be traded or used as collateral. On paper, this was meant to guarantee tenure and prevent a return to landlordism. In practice, it locked over 95% of rural households onto plots smaller than a single hectare, too small for modern machinery or meaningful surplus. Without legal title, smallholders found themselves shut out of formal credit. Banks could not lend against land they could not repossess. Investments in irrigation, improved seed, or even a tractor became rare exceptions, not the rule. The result was a countryside where productivity lagged far behind neighbors like Kenya or Malawi, and where the promise of food security remained elusive. By the early 2020s, wheat imports climbed to nearly 1 million tons per year, a quarter of national consumption, despite decades of state-led planning. The Soviet Union and China once justified collectivization by invoking equality and national strength, yet both paid a steep price in lost output and rural hardship. Ethiopia's experience, though less violent, followed the same logic. Land nationalization became less a tool of justice than a structural trap, preserving dependency and stalling growth long after the original revolution had passed. By the late 2010s, Ethiopia's leaders began to confront the limits of a system that had kept land in state hands for over 4 decades. The homegrown economic reform agenda, launched in 2019, put agriculture at the center of a new national strategy. The government set a 10-year horizon, aiming not just for stability, but for a leap in productivity through modern seed, irrigation, mechanization, and a network of extension services designed to support farmers as active producers, not mere recipients of state direction. A flagship target was wheat. Between 2020 and 2022, 250,000 hectares were earmarked for expansion, with the promise of self-sufficiency. The plan called for yields of 3.5 tons per hectare, a figure that would have doubled historic averages. In reality, output reached about 2.0 tons per hectare. Locust invasions and logistical setbacks exposed the fragility of the new approach, but the government pressed on, framing these shortfalls as challenges to be solved rather than failures to be hidden. In 2023, Ethiopia's rejection of a $500 million wheat import deal from the United States sent a clear message. The state was staking its future on domestic production, even at the risk of short-term scarcity. This was more than symbolism. It was a line drawn between dependency and sovereignty. Yet the story remains unfinished. If farmers are now trusted to deliver the nation's food, the unresolved question lingers. Will they ever be trusted to own the land they work? Private land ownership in Ethiopia has always carried more weight than paperwork. For decades, the World Bank and IMF have argued that, without legal title, farmers remain locked out of credit and investment. No collateral means no loans for irrigation or machinery, leaving rural economies stuck in subsistence. Yet, proposals for privatization stir old anxieties. Memories of forced displacement under the landlord system, and the more recent unease over large-scale lease contracts in Amhara, shape the debate as much as any economic forecast. In 2021, the Amhara Regional Court upheld strict lease limits and required regional approval for transfers, signaling a deep-rooted fear that privatization could concentrate land among elites or outsiders. As a result, long-term certified use rights and leaseholds have emerged as a compromise. These arrangements offer farmers security for up to 30 years, but stop short of full ownership or the right to mortgage land. Policy economists see this as a way to encourage investment while guarding against elite capture. For many rural households, however, the state remains the gatekeeper, and the promise of security is always conditional. The question of ownership remains unresolved, caught between hope for growth and the weight of history. Across Africa, the struggle over farmland has shaped national destinies. Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform, launched with the promise of justice, led to a sharp fall in wheat yields, down nearly a third, and forced thousands from their homes. Recovery took years. Mozambique, wary of repeating this turmoil, passed a 1997 law to secure tenure for smallholders. Yet without strong enforcement, many farmers remained exposed to elite interests and uncertain rights. In Tanzania, a 2017 pilot offered long-term leaseholds. Maize yields climbed by 10 to 15% and land disputes fell, but the program stopped short of granting true ownership. The African Union's Land Policy Initiative now treats Ethiopia as both a caution and a possibility. Its documents cite state control fueling famine, but also highlight recent experiments with certified use rights as a potential path forward. Secure tenure is now seen as essential for building wheat and coffee value chains, attracting agro-processing investment and supporting food sovereignty. Yet the central question endures. Ethiopia is asking its farmers to feed the nation, but the state still hesitates to let them own the soil they work. The continent waits to see if trust will finally take root. Ethiopia's fields are no longer starved by policy, yet ownership remains off limits. The world once watched famine follow forced collectivization, from Russia to China to here. Now, as Ethiopia chases food sovereignty, the question is stark. Will the state finally trust its own farmers with the land beneath their feet?